The morning light filtered in through a cracked window, the kind of light that makes you think everything is okay. Birds chirped outside, my children stirred softly in their sleep. It looked like peace, but I knew better. I wasn't in a cabin retreat, I was in exile. Earlier this year, I woke up and realized I was completely isolated from society. My home was a trailer nestled deep in the woods, 2 bars of 3G service, flickering like the last pulse of a dying connection. The only lifeline I had was the hotspot on my phone, a fragile thread to the rest of the world. It had been months since I'd had face to face contact with anyone outside my household. My days bled into one another, defined by the rustle of trees and the quiet sobs I muffled after the kids went to sleep. Isolation didn't happen all at once. It crept in like fog. There had been years of chipping away at my confidence, my connections, my independence. One by one, people were pushed out of my life. It always came with a reason: they don't support us, or they're a bad influence. And I believed it. Because when you're drowning, even poisoned air can feel like a breath. At first, I thought I was healing. After all, I had escaped the noise of the world. I was sober. I was journaling. I was reading. But something was off. I began to see that the solitude wasn't a sanctuary, it was a cage. I had been cut off not to heal, but to be controlled. There's a kind of madness that lives in prolonged silence. When no one sees you, no one mirrors your truth back to you. You begin to vanish from yourself. I became afraid of my own voice, unsure whether my thoughts were valid or just another sign of instability. That was the worst part. The doubt, not just of him, but of myself. Stoicism entered my life like a whisper. It wasn't a thunderbolt, no epiphany. Just a borrowed copy of Meditations by Marcus Aurelius pages, born from someone else's search for meaning. I read a single line and paused. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. I read that sentence over and over. At first, I felt mocked. How could I possibly have power over anything? But it planted something in me, a seed of resistance. Maybe I couldn't escape the woods. Maybe I couldn't even leave the trailer yet. But I could reclaim my mind. And that was the first real freedom I tasted in months. I started journaling again. I wrote not to be seen, but to see myself. I remembered how Stoics spoke of clarity, seeing things as they are not worse than they are. That was hard. Because the truth hurt. I had contributed to this life, not consciously, not maliciously, but I had surrendered my power. I had given it away piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. The moments that haunted me were not the loud ones, but the quiet betrayals. The comments meant to belittle disguised as concern. The discouragement wrapped in encouragement. The way he'd say, "You're so strong," when I was crying from loneliness, then disappear into his phone. The way he moved us out here after I insisted I needed to return to therapy and said it was for a fresh start. I used to think abuse had to leave bruises. But isolation is its own form of violence. It strips you of your allies, your options, your voice. And worst of all, it makes you think you're the problem. In those months, I became familiar with despair. Not the kind that screams, but the one that simply lies down and fades. But I also discovered something deeper than despair: resolve. Even in that trailer, I found small acts of power, like boiling water for tea, like learning how to use a budgeting app, like writing a single email asking for help, even though my hands trembled the whole time. The Stoics talk about the inner citadel, the fortress inside us that no one can breach. I didn't feel strong, but each time I honored my truth, even silently, I was building that citadel. I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. But I had awakened. And once you wake up, you can't go back to sleep. The world outside didn't know where I was. Most of them had forgotten me, but that didn't matter. I was starting to remember myself, and that was the first step toward freedom. When people hear stories like mine, they often ask the wrong question: why didn't you leave sooner? But control doesn't always scream, it whispers. It praises, it even smiles. And when you're desperate for love, it's easy to mistake a leash for a lifeline. At the beginning, he clapped for me. He cheered. My sobriety told others how proud he was. She's been through hell. He'd say arms around me at parties, but look at her now. I believed him. I thought I was lucky to have someone who stood by me. But over time, his applause began to fade. The more I healed, the quieter he became. It was subtle at first. He'd interrupt my therapy sessions, saying dinner was ready. He'd roll his eyes when I said I needed time to journal. He told me support groups were full of toxic feminists who hated men. When I found online therapy, he accused me of hiding things. And every time I tried to explain, he twisted it. I just want to be part of your healing. That's the trick with manipulation. It hides behind care. It dresses itself in concern, in love, in shared goals. But it always demands your silence in return. One day I told him I felt alone. He smiled and said, "You're never alone, you have me." And that's when it clicked. He didn't want me connected. He wanted me dependent. My independence, once something he admired, had become a threat. There's a Stoic idea that helped me name what I was feeling. If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid. I was beginning to see what was happening, but voicing it made me sound paranoid, dramatic, even ungrateful. And that terrified me, because I had been all those things once. In my lowest moments, I had been unstable. I had been desperate. I had lashed out, numbed myself, collapsed under pressure. He knew this. And now he was using my past as proof against my present. When I tried to stand up for myself, he'd say, "See, you're always so angry. I can't even talk to you." And just like that, the argument became about my tone, not his behavior. This wasn't just about love anymore, it was about control. Still, I clung to the idea that if I just explained better, if I could just communicate perfectly, I could fix it. I told myself I owed him that much. After all, he had supported me through recovery, paid the bills when I couldn't even help to take care of the kids. But that's the fallacy many survivors of emotional abuse live with, that you owe someone your silence in exchange for their bare minimum kindness. The truth is, I did need him for a time. But needing someone doesn't mean they get to define your worth. There was a moment I'll never forget. I had just finished an online session with a therapist I'd scraped together money for. I felt lighter, clearer. I walked into the room smiling. He looked up from his phone and said, "So, how'd it go with your mental health savior?" His voice was calm but condescending. And in that moment, I realized something. He didn't want me to get better. He wanted me to stay broken but manageable. Control doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes with silence, with withdrawal, with carefully timed mockery. It comes with moving us farther into the woods where my lifelines would snap one by one. But Stoicism gave me something he couldn't take: my own clarity. Don't explain your philosophy, embody it. That line stayed with me. I stopped trying to defend myself. I stopped trying to make him see me. I started listening, not to him, but to myself. That was when I stopped asking for permission to exist. I made small changes. I reached out online. I found my voice again, though quietly. And with each step, his discomfort grew. It wasn't me who changed. It was his ability to control me that started to slip. There's a myth that emotional abuse victims are weak. But it takes immense strength to wake up every day, knowing you'll be questioned, minimized, or dismissed, and to keep going anyway. I don't say this to glorify suffering, but to name it. Because once you name it, you can face it. And once you face it, you can begin to walk away. I still don't hate him. That would be easy. What's harder but more powerful is choosing to understand him without accepting his treatment. I see now that he was afraid of change, of my growth, of being left behind. But his fear does not excuse his control. Compassion does not require submission. One night, I sat outside the trailer, wrapped in a blanket, watching the trees sway in the wind. The kids were asleep. My phone buzzed with a message from an old friend I had quietly reconnected with. "You okay?" it said. And I realized I wasn't, but I would be. Because I was no longer asking if I could leave. I was asking how. And that shift made all the difference. It happened on an ordinary day, the kind you think will be uneventful until it changes everything. He walked into the room and looked at me with a flat, unreadable expression. His voice was too calm, rehearsed, almost like a line he'd been waiting to deliver. "I can't be married to a psychopath," he said. No build-up, no preamble. Just the sentence dropped like a hammer. "You need to get out. Immediately." The air in the room changed. It thickened. I looked around as if I could locate some anchor, something to remind me this was still my life. But there was nothing. Just the peeling wallpaper, the kids' drawings taped to the fridge, and his cold certainty. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I just nodded. And in that moment, everything that had been simmering, years of quiet humiliation, of isolation, of making myself smaller, just to survive, boiled over inside me, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no rage. There was only clarity. I had nothing. No savings, no car, no job security. Every dollar I had went into feeding the children, paying for the move, supporting the illusion of a stable home. And now that illusion had shattered. I put the kids to bed that night with a tenderness that felt almost holy. I watched them sleep, memorized their faces, listened to the way their breath evened out in dreams. The idea of leaving them, of not knowing what the next step would be, pressed on my chest like a stone. But I also knew this I would not disappear. Not this time. The next morning, I did something that went against everything I'd been conditioned to do. I reached out. I wrote messages to old friends I hadn't spoken to in years, people I was made to cut off for our marriage. I didn't even explain everything. I just said, "I'm going through a separation. It's sudden. I don't know where to start." I expected silence, but one by one they replied. "I was wondering what happened to you. Are you safe? I'm here if you need anything." These were people who had watched from a distance, people who'd had suspicions but didn't want to interfere. Some had written me off, assuming I'd changed, that I was distant or selfish. Others admitted they thought something wasn't right, but didn't know how to bring it up. The shame I'd carried for so long, fed shame, I believed, began to loosen its grip. But not everyone was supportive. Some accused me of exaggerating, of playing the victim, of trying to ruin a good man's reputation. Women always say abuse when they're angry. Those words stung. They came from mouths I once trusted. But even as I read them, I felt something new rise in me, resolve. Because now I understood that other people's comfort was no longer my responsibility. The Stoics remind us, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke. I clung to that, over and over. It became my armor, my compass. I began to document everything, not to retaliate, but to protect. I knew what would come next. The accusations, the twisting of facts, the slow gaslighting that painted me as unstable, unfit, dangerous. So I wrote things down, I saved messages, I took photos when necessary. For the first time, I chose to believe my own version of reality, not his. And yet, even with that clarity, it hurt. I won't lie to you. It was one of the most painful seasons of my life. Walking through that kind of a heartbreak, not just of a relationship, but of a story you believed in, a life you built, feels like a death. But I didn't let the pain define me. I let it shape me. I remember kneeling on the floor of the trailer, hands pressed against the vinyl, sobbing quietly so I wouldn't wake the kids. I whispered the same thing over and over. I will not break. I will not break. And I didn't. Because something sacred had been born inside me that day. The moment he said I needed to get out, he unknowingly gave me back my agency. He cut the last thread tying me to a life that no longer honored my humanity. I knew the road ahead would be brutal legal battles, custody questions, financial hardship. I had no illusion of ease. But I also knew that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting to be rescued. I was choosing to move forward. I was ready to become the kind of mother, the kind of woman I used to dream about being before I forgot who I was. That day, the world I knew collapsed. But it didn't bury me. It released me. I wish I could tell you that the next chapter began with triumph. That I stood up, found a job, packed my bags, and walked into a new life with my chin held high. But the truth is, the next chapter began with hunger. Some nights I cried myself to sleep on an empty stomach, rationing the last scraps of food for my children. I remember holding a single can of soup and calculating how many spoonfuls I could stretch across two tiny bowls and still leave enough for tomorrow. I learned how to lie without lying, telling my kids I had already eaten when I hadn't, smiling while my stomach churned, pretending to be okay so they wouldn't feel fear. The shame was unbearable. It crept in like mold, slow, toxic, and persistent. I felt worthless. I had nothing, no car, no steady income, no family nearby. The person I once was, the one who believed in herself, felt like a ghost. And yet, even in those moments, I remembered something from meditations. Just that you do the right thing, the rest doesn't matter. That line became my breath. The right thing, I told myself, was to keep my children fed. The right thing was to keep going, to not turn bitterness into my identity. I didn't have to like my circumstances to honor them. I didn't need to feel powerful to act with integrity. I began to approach each day as a test of character. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even noble. It was survival. But it was principled survival. And that made all the difference. I started getting creative. I found an online forum for single mothers and survivors. I posted under an anonymous name and asked for advice. People responded. Strangers. They sent links to food programs, offered emotional support. One woman told me about a church 2 towns over that delivered groceries anonymously. I cried reading her message. Not because of the food, but because someone believed me. That belief was nourishment too. There's a quote from Epictetus I clung to like a lifeline. It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. I taped it above my makeshift desk, right next to a drawing my daughter made of us holding hands under a big sun. That drawing reminded me why I couldn't give up, even when I wanted to. The hardest part wasn't the hunger. It wasn't the uncertainty. It was facing the internal voice that told me I deserved this, that if I had been smarter, stronger, more careful, I wouldn't be here. That voice wore my ex's tone sometimes. Other times it sounded like my own. But here's what Stoicism taught me. Shame is a judgment, not a fact. And judgments can be changed. So I started fighting back, not with rage, not with arguments, but with presence. I began to walk every morning, even if it was just around the trailer. I journaled daily, not to document pain, but to observe it, like a scientist. I wrote things like, "Today, I felt invisible. I made oatmeal with water. The kids laughed when it overflowed. That laugh saved me." I started finding beauty in absurd places, the way light filtered through pine trees, the sound of rain on the tin roof, the weight of my son's head on my shoulder during story time. These were small moments, but they reminded me that I was still alive, still human, still capable of wonder. I began to redefine strength. It wasn't about force, it wasn't even about success. It was about refusal, refusing to become what the pain wanted to turn me into, refusing to close off my heart just because someone else had weaponized theirs. When I could, I meditated. When I couldn't, I breathed deeply. I whispered to myself things Marcus Aurelius might have said: endure and abstain. You were born to do this. Be like the rock that the waves keep crashing over. I wasn't trying to become a Stoic philosopher. I was trying to survive without breaking my soul. And as strange as it sounds, I began to feel gratitude. Not for the suffering, but for the clarity it brought. I had spent so long trying to control how others saw me, trying to fix their perceptions, win their approval. Now I was learning how to let that go. Because when you're hungry and scared, and still choose not to give in to hate, that's something no one can take from you. One night, as the kids slept and the world was dark, I sat outside and looked at the stars. I thought about everything I'd lost. Then I thought about everything I'd gained: my awareness, my voice, my boundaries, my peace. Peace that didn't come from comfort, but from knowing that even in the darkest hour, I had chosen light. I went to bed that night still hungry, but not starving, not spiritually, and that distinction changed everything. There's a strange moment that happens when your life starts to shift, even just slightly. You start to believe again in yourself, in the idea that you might not be the person your abuser said you were. That maybe your truth matters more than their version of it. But then come the voices, not just his, everyone else's too. Whispers from people who think they know, people who heard his side and decided it was enough. People who looked at me and said things like, "Are you sure it wasn't just a rough patch, but he always seemed so good with the kids?" Or worse, "You women throw around the word abuse too easily these days." Each time I felt my confidence fracture. Not break, but fracture. A hairline crack in my certainty one I had to seal shut with relentless inner work. Because I knew what I had endured. I had lived it. But their doubt made me question myself all over again. That's when I found this quote by Marcus Aurelius. "If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed. It is the person who continues in his self-deception and ignorance who is harmed." I read it again and again. It reminded me that I could hold two things at once: humility and clarity. That I could remain open to truth, but not so open that other people's denial drowned my own knowing. I had been labeled everything: unstable, manipulative, dramatic. My ex was strategic. He didn't need to scream to be cruel, he just needed to plant doubt. With friends, with family, even with myself. He weaponized my history of therapy like it was a weakness. He called me paranoid, said I was overreacting, that I had always had problems, that I needed help, just not the kind I was getting. He told others I was a narcissist, that I was emotionally abusive, that I was neglectful. And because he spoke calmly and I sometimes spoke through tears, many believed him. But I refused to become the version of myself they painted. That was the Stoic fork in the road. Do I allow other people's judgments to become my truth, or do I stand quietly inside my integrity, even if no one else can see it? I chose the latter. I stopped defending myself in conversations where my character was under attack. I learned to say things like, "That's not how I experienced it," or "I understand you see it differently," and then let the silence do the rest. That was one of the hardest lessons, knowing when to speak and knowing when to simply be. I also learned to audit my own reactions. If someone criticized me, I no longer asked, "How dare they?" Instead, I asked, "Is any part of that true?" And if it wasn't, I let it pass like wind through an open window, because some words aren't worth catching. There was a day when my ex called a friend of mine and said I was having an episode. That friend called me panicked and asked, "Are you okay?" I laughed. Not bitterly, just tired. "Yes," I said. "I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed. But I'm not having an episode." And in that moment, I realized something. He was still trying to write my story. But I had taken the pen back. I started writing more. Not just in my journal, but letters I never sent. Letters to myself. Letters to my children in the future. Letters to the younger version of me who didn't know what gaslighting was, who thought love meant sacrificing her identity. And slowly I started to see the narrative shift, not around me, but within me. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't unstable. I was someone who had survived. Someone who had tried. Someone who had the courage to leave when staying felt safer. That's what Stoicism gave me. Not immunity to pain, but the ability to separate my identity from other people's perception of me. It reminded me that the only opinion that matters is the one grounded in truth and inner stillness. So when people said, "I heard you were hard to live with," I said, "I probably was. Living in fear will do that to a person." When they said, "But you always looked so happy," I replied, I smiled a lot. That was the only thing I could control. And when someone close to me whispered, "Are you sure you're not making him out to be worse than he was?" I said simply, he was exactly who he needed to be to survive. And so was I. Because I'm no longer interested in proving anyone wrong. I'm interested in becoming someone my children can look up to. Someone I can look up to. And for that, I don't need anyone's permission. There's a moment in every transformation where pain stops being something that drowns you and starts becoming something that refines you. For me, that moment came in the middle of a conversation I'll never forget. I was on the phone with a distant relative, someone who hadn't spoken to me in years but had just heard the news. Their voice dripped with concern, the kind that masks judgment. "I mean, I hope you're okay," they said. "But I have to be honest, it sounds like you're just bitter. Just bitter." It hung in the air like an accusation and a dismissal all at once. And for a second, just a second, I wanted to shout, to defend myself, to scream about the sleepless nights, the bruises, the threats, the hunger. I wanted to make them see. But instead, I just exhaled, a long, slow breath that came from the deepest part of me. And I said, "Thank you for your concern." Then I hung up. That was the moment I knew something inside me had changed, not hardened, but clarified. It wasn't that the humiliation was gone. It was still there, thick and hot and close. Humiliation at having let it get this far, at having been so blind, at having trusted someone who never truly saw me. But I had stopped letting that humiliation define me. It became fire not to destroy, but to purify. There's a Stoic principle I carried like armor through those days. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Ryan Holiday calls it the obstacle is the way. And this shame, this rage, this humiliation, it became the obstacle that sharpened my direction. Because I had a choice, I could drown in the story he told about me, or I could write a new one. So I picked up the pen. I stopped waiting for justice to feel good. I stopped expecting apologies that would never come. I stopped believing that healing required acknowledgement from the person who hurt me. Instead, I built a fire beneath myself. Quiet, steady, fierce. That fire lit my discipline. It burned away my excuses. It kept me warm when the rest of the world turned cold. And yes, some days the flames rose too high. Some days the bitterness tried to creep in like smoke under a door. But I sat with it. I named it. I let it pass. Because I knew I couldn't afford to let rage become my compass. Anger may be a spark, but it's truth that keeps the fire clean. There's a misconception that not seeking revenge means weakness, that forgiveness is surrender. But I've learned that choosing peace in the face of injustice is one of the most rebellious things you can do. It disarms your enemy, it disorients the narrative, it shows the world that you are unshakable, not because you weren't hurt, but because you refused to stay broken. And that started to become my quiet rebellion calmness. The more I stayed centered, the more he unraveled. His accusations became louder, more erratic. He began calling friends and sharing my private mental health history. He tried to prove I was unstable. But the calmer I stayed, the more his words began to crack under their own weight. Because truth doesn't shout, it stands. Every time I responded with clarity instead of chaos, people began to notice. That's not the person he described, they started saying. She seems grounded, focused. Slowly his version of me began to lose its grip. I didn't do it to win, I did it because I had to. For my kids, for myself. For the part of me that still believed I could create a better life from the ashes of the old one. There's a fire beneath every humiliation. And if you don't feed it carefully, it becomes destructive. But if you learn how to tend it, to use it, to let it fuel you rather than consume you, it becomes sacred. My sacred fire burned quietly. It looked like paperwork, like court documents, like budgeting spreadsheets, like whispered phone calls late at night to strangers who would become lifelines, like silence when provoked, like restraint when slandered, like long walks in the cold to remind myself I was still here, still moving, still choosing life. I no longer needed to prove him wrong. I just needed to be right with myself. And that was the truest revenge of all peace. So if you're aware, I was ashamed, humiliated, unsure if anyone will believe you listen to me. You are not your humiliation. You are not what they say. You are the fire beneath the rubble waiting to rise. I used to think silence meant weakness. That if I didn't fight back, scream louder, prove my truth with fury, I would be swallowed whole. But now, I know calm is not the absence of strength. It is strength refined. As the weeks unfolded, the chaos around me intensified. My ex became erratic. In public, he kept up the same calm, collected mask he'd always worn. But behind closed doors, or in private messages to friends in late-night voicemails, he didn't know I saved his mask began to slip. The lies came fast, twisted and strange. I had kidnapped the children. I was mentally unstable. I had stolen from him. He cast himself as the victim and me as a dangerous figure unraveling at the seams. But I didn't flinch, not this time. I remembered the words of Epictetus. When someone irritates you, it is not his actions that disturb you, but your judgment of them. So remove your judgment and you are free. That became my mantra. So I stopped reacting, I stopped justifying, I stopped arguing in texts I knew were bait. I simply documented. I made phone calls to domestic support lines. I told the truth quietly, consistently, without venom. And I let his behavior reveal itself. At first it was terrifying. What if people believed him? What if the court believed him? What if my children were taken from me because I was too quiet? But over time I saw something astonishing. The calmer I remained, the more absurd his stories became. His contradictions piled up. His anger flared. His words betrayed him. He couldn't keep his lies straight, not in court filings, not in voicemails, not in front of mutual friends. He began calling people I hadn't spoken to in years, trying to smear me in advance. But when they spoke to me and saw how measured I was, something didn't add up, and that discrepancy began to work in my favor. The calm became its own kind of witness, one that required no exaggeration, only endurance. There was a moment, a turning point. He had sent a particularly cruel message full of half truths and veiled threats. Instead of responding, I took a deep breath and reread a quote from Seneca: "A sword never kills anybody. It is a tool in the killer's hand. Anger is a weapon, and the angry man is the one who kills." I realized his goal wasn't just to paint me as unstable. It was to make me unstable. To push me to react so he could say, "See, I told you." But I denied him that satisfaction. Instead, I turned inward. I deepened my practices: morning journaling, long walks, gentle stretching with my children on the floor, and silence. Deep, nourishing silence. That silence wasn't passive, it was strategic, it was powerful. It was the still lake that reflects truth when the storm above has passed. And in that stillness, something shifted, not just outside of me, but within. I began to feel a new kind of confidence. Not the bravado I used to fake when I was masking pain, but real confidence. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that holds its ground even when others try to tear it up. The calm didn't mean I wasn't hurting. I still had moments where I fell apart in private. Nights when I couldn't sleep. Days when fear clung to my spine like a second skin. But I met those moments with breath, with compassion, and with the quiet reminder that I was no longer powerless. Because power doesn't always come with a raised voice. Sometimes it comes in the form of a pause, a refusal to stoop, a choice to carry yourself with dignity even when no one else offers it to you. That's what Stoicism taught me, that suffering is inevitable, but becoming bitter is optional. That injustice may find you, but dignity is something you never have to surrender. In court, I sat still. I didn't plead. I didn't unravel. I answered questions clearly. I brought documents, evidence, timelines. I let the facts speak where I no longer needed to. And that unnerved him more than any outburst could have. Because when you stop trying to control how others see you, you start to become undeniable. I stopped needing everyone to believe me. I just needed to believe myself. And that belief, quiet, grounded, unshakable, became my anchor. I think sometimes of the people who still believe his version of the story, and it used to devastate me. But now I offer them grace from a distance, because belief is a choice, and so is clarity. I no longer try to force either on anyone. My responsibility is not to change minds. It is to live my truth so clearly, so calmly, so consistently that the lies exhaust themselves trying to keep up. And that is exactly what began to happen. He tripped over his own narrative, and I walked forward one steady step at a time with the kind of peace no one could fake and no one could take. I always thought strength meant doing it all alone. For years I wore independence like armor, hard, shiny, and impenetrable. I prided myself on carrying too much, on being the one who never needed anyone, on solving every crisis with grit and silence. I had learned that asking for help was weakness, that it invited scrutiny, that it gave people ammunition to label me broken, unstable, or unworthy. So when everything fell apart, my first instinct was to retreat deeper into myself. But I couldn't. I had children to protect, no transportation, no income to rely on, no secure home, and no choice but to admit the most difficult truth I had ever faced: I couldn't do it alone. The first time I asked for help, my hands trembled. I typed a short post into an online forum, just a few lines. No details, no drama, just going through separation. Need advice. I have 2 kids and no support nearby. And then I waited, expecting silence, expecting judgment, expecting the same suspicion I had already encountered from others. Instead, I was met with something else: compassion. Complete strangers replied with phone numbers, links, encouragement. One woman told me how she had left a similar situation 10 years ago and now ran a support group. Another sent me a list of local services, some I didn't even know existed. Someone else offered to talk on the phone just to listen. I cried harder reading those messages than I had during the entire separation, because for the first time in a long time I felt seen without being judged, heard without being doubted. It felt like breathing air after being underwater. And that opened the door. I started reaching out more old friends, online, advocates, even Reddit. I explained my situation plainly without begging or performing or softening the truth. And what happened next changed everything. Veterans sent me links to military spouse legal aid. Therapists offered discounted sessions or resources. People DM'd me templates for legal forms. I was sent lists of shelters, food banks, childcare grants. One woman, a lawyer, even walked me through separation strategy and told me what to document to protect myself legally. It was overwhelming in the best way, but it also forced me to confront something deeper: the shame I carried around asking for help. I had to face my ego head on. That stubborn voice in my head said things like, if you were really strong, you wouldn't need them. You're burdening people. You're proving him right. You're too much. But every time I pushed through those thoughts, every time I allowed someone to help me, that voice got quieter. It didn't disappear, but it lost its grip. Because what I came to understand was this: asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It takes courage to admit you don't know the way forward. It takes strength to say, I'm struggling. It takes humility to accept a lifeline when your pride says drown. The Stoics taught me that control begins within, but they also taught me that we are interconnected. That virtue isn't self-sufficiency alone, but service, resilience, and the ability to work with what life gives you, including the hands reaching out to help. There's a quote I return to often from Marcus Aurelius: don't be ashamed of needing help. You have a duty to fulfill, just like a soldier on the wall of battle. So what if you are injured and need a comrade's hand? That line cracked me open. I was a soldier, not in a traditional war, but in the daily battle to rebuild my life, protect my children, and preserve my sanity. And I wasn't alone on the wall anymore. One friend drove 3 hours to take me to a legal consultation. Another started dropping off groceries on the weekends without even asking. One neighbor slipped a handwritten note through my door. You're not invisible. You're doing great. These were small gestures, but they stitched me back together. The more I accepted help, the more stable I became. Not dependent, supported. There's a difference. Support uplifts. Dependency depletes. The help I received didn't take my power, it restored it. I started keeping a gratitude journal. Not for the good things only, but for the real things. I wrote, today I cried on the phone, and the woman on the other end didn't hang up. Someone sent me a $25 gift card with a note for the kids. Get snacks. I walked into the clinic alone, but walked out with the lawyer's number. And one day I wrote, I no longer feel like I'm drowning. That's when I realized strength doesn't mean never falling. It means having the humility to reach out when you do. We were never meant to survive alone. And now that I know that I never will again, it would have been easy to hate him, to focus only on the things he did wrong, to replay the threats, the manipulation, the abandonment. I had more than enough ammunition. I had screenshots, recordings, evidence. I had memories that made my stomach twist. I could have built a fortress out of rage and justified every brick, but I didn't. Because I learned that living in hate is just another form of captivity. It may feel like power, but it drains you. It makes your ex the center of your story even after they've left your life. And I had no interest in giving him that role. So instead of hate, I reached for something deeper principle. I remember reading something by Seneca that struck me like lightning. A good character, when established, becomes a shield that cannot be penetrated. That's what I wanted, not just to survive, but to become someone I respected. Someone my children could look at and say, she chose the harder path, the higher one. So I made a choice to speak with honesty, not vengeance. To act with clarity, not spite. To pursue what was right, not just for me, but for the long arc of our children's future. That doesn't mean I minimized what happened. It means I stopped letting it dictate my values. I could have called him names. I could have posted publicly about the lies, the threats, the emotional warfare. But none of that would have served my peace, and none of it would have changed the past. So I chose to thank him instead. Yes, thank him. Not to absolve him, not to excuse him, but because gratitude is the most powerful exit from a story you've outgrown. I thanked him for taking care of me when he did, for giving me children I adore more than life itself, for teaching me how to skin an animal, how to pitch a tent, how to survive in silence, for the good moments because they were real even if they were fleeting, even if they weren't enough. Gratitude didn't erase the pain, it refined it. Because once I stopped trying to make him the villain, I stopped needing to be the victim. And that's when I truly began to heal. I started looking at everything through a different lens. What is the lesson here? What virtue can I extract from this pain? The betrayal, it taught me boundaries. The silence, it taught me to listen to myself. The abandonment, it taught me to stand on my own 2 feet. And most of all, it taught me this: pain is not punishment, it is information, it is transformation. Viktor Frankl once wrote, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. That became my compass. I couldn't control him. I couldn't make others see the truth. But I could live a life rooted in values, not reactions. So I started defining those values. Clarity, dignity, kindness, but not at the expense of truth. And I began to see how Stoicism, which had once seemed distant and philosophical, was now living inside me. Not as a shield, but as a foundation. I stopped responding to every provocation. I let the court speak where I no longer needed to. I showed up with records, not rage. I parented with consistency, not fear. I journaled my anger so I wouldn't weaponize it in real life. And when I made mistakes, which I did, I owned them quickly, quietly, and without shame. This was a new version of me. One that didn't need to be liked, validated, or rescued. One that could live with discomfort without exploding. One that could sit in grief without drowning. And in that stillness, I realized something else. This wasn't just about getting away from a man. It was about breaking a generational pattern. My mother had stayed. Her mother had stayed. Each one a woman who gave and gave, hoping their man would change, praying that love would be enough. I didn't want that story anymore. I didn't want my daughter to watch me beg for crumbs of respect. I didn't want my son to think dominance was love. I wanted a new blueprint, one built not on suffering but on principle. So I stopped centering the pain. I started centering the growth. And day by day I became the kind of woman I had always admired, but never believed I could be calm, clear, self-respecting. Not perfect, but present. I stopped asking why it happened. I started asking, what now? And the answer was simple. Live well. Love my children. Hold my values like a torch. Let the past be what it was without letting it define who I become. The first time I gathered evidence, my hands were shaking. It felt wrong, like I was betraying someone. Like I was crossing a line. For so long I had been trained to protect him, his image, his privacy, his reputation. But I wasn't building a case out of revenge. I was building a case out of necessity, because I knew what was coming. He had already begun spinning stories, twisting the truth, calling friends, planting doubt. It was subtle at first, and then it got bold. So I started writing things down. Every insult disguised as a joke. Every threat tucked into a calm voice. Every instance of neglect. I began keeping a folder. Photos, emails, voicemails, screenshots. I documented the bruise he left on our child's arm. The night he slammed the door so hard, it cracked the frame. The message he left, threatening to come with a gun just to scare me straight. These weren't just memories anymore, they were facts. And facts matter, because the truth doesn't always win on its own. It needs a witness, and sometimes you have to be your own. There's a quote by Epictetus that stayed with me during those long nights. First say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. I wanted to be safe. I wanted to be stable. I wanted to be free, so I did what I had to do. I called legal hotlines that veterans had sent me. I sat on hold for hours while the kids napped. I explained my situation again and again to overworked lawyers and underfunded clinics. I learned legal terms I never wanted to know. I printed forms I barely understood and filled them out anyway. I showed up trembling to consultations in borrowed cars, with a folder clutched to my chest like armor. Preparation didn't make it easy, but it made it possible. And each step I took, each document gathered, each call, made return the piece of my power. I stopped being afraid of the courtroom. I stopped being intimidated by his threats. Because now I had facts. I had timelines. I had testimony. I had truth with a paper trail. More importantly, I had clarity. And clarity is stronger than fear. There was a shift in my posture, in the way I answered his texts, in the tone of my voice when speaking to caseworkers. I no longer sounded desperate. I sounded ready. I didn't come with emotion. I came with evidence. When I started preparing, I stopped hoping he would change. I stopped hoping anyone would save me. I realized that power isn't loud, it's thorough. It's consistent. It's calm. It's the woman who doesn't flinch when they try to rattle her because she already knows what's coming. I taught myself to speak in bullet points. To say things like, on April 9th, he failed to pick up the children. Here is the email from the pediatrician expressing concern. This is a photo of our living conditions before the separation. And each time I showed up prepared, he showed up erratic. He would rant, ramble, contradict himself, insult me under his breath, try to draw me out into an argument. But I didn't take the bait. I kept my face still and my voice steady. Because this wasn't about winning, it was about protecting my children and building a life we could count on. Preparation made me resilient. And the more I prepared, the more I realized how unprepared he was. Because he had always relied on chaos, on my silence, on the emotional exhaustion he could stir up like dust. But now I was grounded, rooted, stoic. There's something about knowing you've done everything in your power to protect the truth. It doesn't make the process easier, but it gives you peace. And that peace is priceless. Friends noticed the change in me. "You're so calm," one said. "You look taller," another joked. But I didn't feel taller. I felt anchored. I no longer needed to rehearse my defense in my head. I had already spoken it with actions, with documentation, with presence. And in doing so, I began to model something for my children too. They saw a mother who didn't scream, who didn't seek pity, who didn't fall apart when things got hard. They saw a mother who showed up, who asked questions, who built a plan. One day my daughter said, "Mom, I'm glad you don't yell like he does." And I broke, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. Because all the preparation, all the effort, all the documentation wasn't just for me. It was for them. To show them what it looks like to protect your peace with principles. To show them that fear doesn't get to write the future. that if you're willing to prepare not just legally, but mentally, emotionally, spiritually, there's nothing you can't walk through. So I kept going. One phone call at a time, one form at a time, one brave, quiet act at a time, because preparation is power. And I was no longer powerless. It started with a small decision, opening a new bank account. It seems so trivial now, walking into a local branch, sitting with a banker, showing my ID. But to me, it was a revolution. For years, every penny I earned passed through his hands. Every freelance deposit, every tax return, every grocery receipt. I justified it. We're a team, I told myself. We share everything. Until I realized we didn't. He had control. I had accountability. So I opened a new account in my name only. I changed my direct deposits. I moved what little money I had. And when I walked out of that building, it felt like I had just taken my first real breath in years. That was the beginning. From there, I started taking bolder steps. I registered an LLC. I formalized the freelancing work I'd been doing quietly for years, editing digital design, writing contracts. Work I had once treated like a hobby because he treated it like a joke. Your little side gigs, he'd say. But they were never small. They were the bones of the life I was now building. And to my surprise, once I took myself seriously, others did too. Clients came back, rates increased, income doubled. I stopped asking for his permission financially, emotionally, spiritually. I stopped explaining every decision. I stopped justifying every dollar I spent. I started rebuilding the boundary between my life and his expectations. He noticed. The threats escalated. The guilt trips multiplied. He said I was greedy. That I was becoming just like every other liberal bitch who steals money from hard-working men. He told me if I really wanted independence, I wouldn't take a penny from him. And for a moment, that struck a nerve. I almost agreed. I almost let my pride convince me that accepting child support or alimony was weakness, that it meant I hadn't really made it. But then I remembered something a stranger on Reddit had said after I posted anonymously about the situation, that money isn't for you. It's for your kids. Don't let your ego rob them of stability. That stopped me cold, because I had been operating from pride. Pride in my strength. Pride in my self-reliance. Pride in my survival. But survival isn't the goal anymore. Stability is. Growth is. Peace is. So I filed for support. Not out of vengeance, but responsibility, I looked into every legal protection available to me as a military spouse. I took every resource offered. Not to drain him, but to secure them. My children. Their future. I created an emergency fund. I wrote down medical needs. I made a plan for months ahead, not just weeks. For the first time, I was no longer reacting, I was designing. That's when I realized I hadn't just reclaimed my finances. I had reclaimed my name. For so long, he controlled the narrative. He called me unstable, difficult, dramatic. He rewrote our past in conversations I never got to enter. And for years, I let that happen. Because I was scared. Because I didn't believe I could tell my story without falling apart. But now I didn't need to shout it. I lived it. People started noticing. You seem clearer, someone said. Another told me, you've got this quiet power now. And I knew it wasn't quiet. It was contained. It was owned. That's what happens when you stop chasing vindication and start standing in your truth. You stop trying to be seen, and instead, you see yourself. I became protective of that self. I curated my circle. I let go of people who thrived on gossip, on doubt, on both sides' arguments. I kept those who asked real questions, who didn't need me to perform my pain to believe me. I built a new social fabric, one thread at a time. I began setting new rules for my life. If something costs my peace, it's too expensive. If I wouldn't want my children to accept it, I won't either. If I wouldn't speak that way to a friend, I won't speak that way to myself. And with each rule, I came back to myself. Stoicism taught me this truth. External things may be taken from you, but character is yours alone. He had tried to take everything, my home, my support, network, my self-belief, but he couldn't take me. And I'll be honest, it still hurts sometimes. There are still days where I feel the sting of what could have been. Days when I want to scream, "Why did you do this to me?" Days when the weight of rebuilding feels too heavy. But then I remember, this is my life now. My name is on the lease, my hands are on the steering wheel. My words are my own. I no longer ask for permission to live. I no longer apologize for surviving. I am not his wife. I am not their gossip. I am not my past. I am me. And that is enough. 6 months ago, I was lying on the floor of a trailer, sobbing quietly while my children slept in the next room. I was starving physically and emotionally. I had no plan, no car, no money. I didn't know how we would make it to the next week, let alone the next year. But I knew this, I would not let my children grow up watching their mother shrink. I had grown up with that image, strong women made small by circumstance. My mother stayed, her mother stayed, and now here I was standing at the edge of the same cliff they had faced, holding the hands of 2 little ones who deserved better than silence and fear. That was the day I made a vow whispered into the cold stillness of a sleepless night. The cycle ends with me. I didn't fully know what that meant yet. I just knew I couldn't continue repeating the patterns I had inherited, ones that taught us to tolerate mistreatment, to over-explain, to forgive, before accountability to confuse love with pain. I began to do the work. Not just the survival work, finding housing, income, legal aid, but the soul work. The unlearning, the looking inward, the facing of everything I once buried. I let myself grieve. I let myself rage in safe ways. I let myself sit in the discomfort of being misunderstood and misrepresented. And then I let myself grow. I read meditations until I could recite lines in my sleep. I wrote out affirmations that weren't just wishful thinking, but declarations of self-worth. I said to myself again and again, I am no longer available for pain disguised as love. My healing didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, in layers, in small wins and quiet choices, like choosing not to reply to his latest insult, like choosing to eat 3 meals a day, even if they were humble, like choosing to laugh with my children, even when fear whispered through the walls. I began to model peace for them. I taught them breathing exercises. We talked about feelings. We planted seeds in pots outside our new apartment and watched them grow. My son said, "This one's mine. I'm gonna take care of it." And I smiled because that's what I was doing too, taking care of something I'd ignored too long, my own soul. There's a quote by Thich Nhat Hanh that lives inside me now. When you plant lettuce, if it does not grow well, you don't blame the lettuce. You look for reasons it is not doing well. It may need fertilizer, or more water, or less sun. You never blame the lettuce. I stopped blaming myself for not thriving in toxic soil, and I stopped blaming others for planting me there. Instead, I chose to replant in a space of truth, in the soil of silence, integrity, boundaries, and courage. This isn't just a story of leaving a man. This is a story of leaving behind a version of myself that once believed suffering was noble, that being chosen meant being worthy, that endurance was the same as love. It's not. Love, real love, does not erase you. It reflects you, and now I reflect myself, clearly, without distortion, without apology. When people ask how I'm doing now, I smile and say I'm rebuilding. Not from scratch, but from truth. I've made peace with the fact that some people will never believe me, that some will forever cling to the story he told because it's more convenient than the one I've lived. That's okay, because belief is not a requirement for healing. What matters is that I believe me. What matters is that my children see me living with conviction and calm. What matters is that I didn't let my pain turn into poison. I look at them sometimes when they're sleeping. I run my fingers through their hair and whisper, "You will never have to wonder if your mother tried." I tried. And I did more than survive. I transcended. Now I look forward. Not with naive hope, but with earned wisdom. With the understanding that life will throw more storms, more loss, more uncertainty. But I no longer fear it, because I know who I am now. I am the one who rose, who asked for help, who stayed calm in the chaos, who prepared, who spoke the truth even when no one was listening, who let go not to forget but to forgive myself. I don't need revenge. I don't need permission. I just need peace and the strength to hold it every single day. The cycle ends with me, and from here everything begins.